My name is Renata, and I was 32 years old the morning a neighbor called to tell me my grandmother's house had a for sale sign in the yard. Not my mother, not my uncle, not anyone in my family. A neighbor named Dottie, who had lived across the street from my grandmother for 19 years, and who had my number because she used to call me when the gutters needed clearing. She said, "Honey, I thought you knew." I didn't know. When I called my uncle that same morning, he picked up on the third ring and said, "It's already decided. The closing is Friday." And then, in a voice that was not unkind, just finished, "We didn't think you needed to be involved in this one." I stood in my kitchen and felt something drop through the center of me. Not anger, not yet, something quieter than that. The kind of stillness that comes right before you understand exactly what has happened. What my uncle didn't know, what no one in that family had thought to verify, was that my grandmother had already signed something. 2 years before they listed the property. Before the real estate agent. Before the sign in Dottie's sightline. A document that was sitting in a county office, filed and dated, and that meant the closing that was scheduled for Friday was not going to happen the way anyone in that conference room was expecting. I didn't call my uncle back. I called a title officer instead. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork speak first. If you're new here, hit subscribe. A new story goes up every week, and you won't want to miss what's ahead. My grandmother's name was Helen Vasquez, and she had lived in the same house on Crestwood Lane for 41 years. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you anything else. 41 years in one place is not an accident. It is a decision made repeatedly, every year, against 100 small pressures that accumulate over time. The offers from developers, the suggestions from well-meaning relatives, the logic of downsizing, the economics of a neighborhood in transition. My grandmother made that decision every single year and arrived at the same answer, which was that the house on Crestwood Lane was hers, and she intended to stay in it. She had bought the property with my grandfather in 1981, the year my mother was born. My grandfather passed when I was 4, so my memories of him are thin and mostly borrowed from photographs, but my memories of that house are dense and specific in the way that only childhood places ever are. The smell of the kitchen on Sunday mornings, coffee and something baking, always something baking. The particular creak of the third stair from the bottom that my grandmother never had fixed because she said it told her when anyone was sneaking down for water after bedtime. The garden along the back fence that she tended with a seriousness I didn't fully appreciate until I was old enough to understand that a garden that well-kept requires a person who shows up for it every single day without being asked. My grandmother was that kind of person. The showing up kind. There were 4 of us grandchildren. My cousin Derek, who was the oldest and had moved to Denver after college and come back rarely. My cousin Melissa, who lived 20 minutes from the house and had a relationship with my grandmother that was warm and surface level in equal measure. The birthday calls, the Easter visits, the holiday presents that satisfied the appearance of closeness without requiring much underneath. My younger brother Tomas, who was a good person and mostly absent, working long hours at a job he was proud of in a city 3 states over. And me. I was the one who stayed. Not because I didn't have options. I had a degree in environmental compliance and a job with the county water district that I'd built carefully over 6 years, and I lived 25 minutes from Crestwood Lane not by accident but by something I had never examined too closely, a pull I understood better in retrospect than I did while it was happening. I visited my grandmother every week. Not every other week, not when it was convenient. Every week, usually Thursday evenings, sometimes Saturday afternoons, occasionally both. I brought groceries when she ran low. I dealt with the contractors when the roof needed patching. I sat with her through the slow administrative tedium of getting her medications adjusted after her cardiologist changed her dosage protocol, which involved 4 phone calls and 2 appeals, and a level of paperwork that I think most people would have given up on after the second round. My grandmother noticed things. That was one of her defining characteristics, a quality of attention that missed very little and forgot almost nothing. She noticed that I came every week. She noticed that I didn't tell anyone I was coming, didn't post about it, didn't bring it up at family gatherings as evidence of my devotion. She noticed that I fixed the latch on the back gate without being asked and didn't mention it afterward. She noticed all of it, and she said very little about any of it, which was also her way. She was not a woman who narrated her own observations back to you. She just absorbed them and filed them somewhere internal. What I did not know during all of those Thursday evenings and Saturday afternoons was that she was also thinking, planning, arranging things quietly in the background the way she arranged the garden, methodically, without drama, with an eye toward what would still be standing long after the season changed. Now let me tell you about my uncle. My Uncle Roberto, formerly, though no one had called him that since approximately the Carter administration, was my grandmother's son, her only son, and the person who had historically taken point on any matter that involved paperwork, logistics, or anything that could be framed as a practical decision requiring a practical mind. He was 61 years old, recently retired from a career in commercial insurance, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from decades of being the person in the room who is assumed to know what he's talking about. He was not cruel. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters. He was not someone who plotted against people or enjoyed exclusion for its own sake. He was someone who had a way of organizing the world into categories, relevant and not relevant, important and not important, consulted and not consulted, and I had, somewhere along the way, drifted into the second column of each of those pairings without either of us quite noticing it happen. His daughter Melissa was in the first column. She had 2 children, she lived nearby, she had a husband who played golf with Berto on weekends. She was, in the taxonomy my uncle operated by, family in the active sense, present, legible, someone whose stake in things was visible and therefore counted. My stake in things was not invisible. It was just quiet, and quiet in my family had a way of being mistaken for absent. I had been supplementing my grandmother's household costs for 3 years by the time any of this happened. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would have noticed unless they were looking. Her property taxes had gone up 2 years running, and her fixed income hadn't, and I had looked at the numbers one Thursday evening when she mentioned offhandedly that she'd been thinking about whether to reduce the heating hours, and I had done the math and started making up the difference. $412 a month, transferred quietly and automatically, beginning in March of the year she turned 82. I had not told anyone. I had not told my grandmother I was doing it. Initially, I had simply adjusted the automatic payment on her utilities account, which she had added me to years ago for exactly the kind of logistical convenience that she preferred not to have to call and ask for. When she realized what I'd done about 6 weeks in, she called me on a Thursday morning instead of waiting for my evening visit. She did not thank me. She said, "I see what you did." And then, after a moment, "I'm going to remember that." I told her it wasn't necessary. She said, "I know it isn't." That was the whole conversation. That was my grandmother. The house on Crestwood Lane had been assessed at approximately $340,000 the last time I'd seen the county records, which I had occasion to look at during a work project that involved a neighboring parcel. It was not a dramatic number. The neighborhood was solidly working class, and the house itself was a 3-bedroom with an attached garage and a garden that any developer would have ripped out in the first week. But it was a corner lot with good bones, and more relevantly, it was fully paid off. My grandfather had made the final mortgage payment in 2003, and my grandmother had kept the deed in a fire-resistant box in the hall closet ever since. I knew about the deed because I was the one who had found the box when she couldn't remember where she'd put it 2 years prior, when the county had sent her a property tax statement with an error that needed correcting. We had sat together at her kitchen table, the box open between us, and I had helped her find the relevant document and make a copy and write the letter to the county assessor's office. It had not occurred to me at the time that she was paying attention to considerably more than the tax correction. It had not occurred to me that while I was helping her with that letter, she was making a different set of notes entirely. The first indication that something was happening with the property came not from my family but from Dottie Marchetti, who lived in the blue house directly across Crestwood Lane and who had been my grandmother's neighbor and occasional afternoon coffee companion for 19 years. Dottie was 74, sharp, opinionated about municipal politics, and constitutionally incapable of minding her own business in any situation she felt touched the people she cared about, which I had always considered one of her better qualities. She called me on a Wednesday morning in early October. I was at my desk reviewing a remediation report when my phone buzzed with her name. "Renata," she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who is trying to deliver information gently but does not have a gentle gear. "There's a sign in Helen's yard. A real estate sign. I thought you knew." I asked her to describe it. She described it. Agency name, contact number. The word coming soon in large letters across the top. Something went tight in my throat. I thanked Dottie. I sat very still for a moment with my hand flat on my desk. Then I pulled up the county assessor's website and searched the address on Crestwood Lane. The listing was there. Active. Listed 6 days prior, which meant the sign had gone up 6 days ago, which meant my grandmother's house had been on the market for 6 days and I had found out from a neighbor across the street. I called my uncle. He picked up on the third ring. His voice was normal, easy, unhurried, the voice of someone who had not done anything they considered worth concealing. Berto, I said. There's a listing on Grandma's house. A brief pause. Yeah, he said. We talked about it. It made sense. I asked who we was. Me and your mother, and Melissa was in the loop. It's your grandmother's getting older, Renata, and the house is a lot to maintain, and there's a facility over on Ridgeway that has a really good. I asked when they had discussed this. We've been talking about it for a few months, he said. And then, settling into something final. It's already decided. The closing is Friday. I stood in the hallway of my office building with my back against the wall and something dropping steadily through the center of my chest, floor by floor, like something cut loose from its cable. What closing? I said. You have a buyer? Accepted an offer 3 weeks ago, he said. Cash offer above asking. It moved fast. Listen, it's a family decision. We talked it through and your grandmother agreed it was the right move. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's done. My grandmother had agreed. My uncle had said my grandmother agreed. I said I needed to think. He said, there's not much to think about at this point, Renata. I'm sorry we didn't loop you in earlier. We should have called. He didn't sound sorry exactly. He sounded like a man who was already on to the next item on his list. I hung up. I drove to Crestwood Lane. My grandmother was in the kitchen when I arrived. She was making tea. She looked up when I came in through the back door. I had a key, had always had a key, and her expression did not change in any significant way. She looked the way she always looked, composed, attentive, not surprised. I said, Grandma, did you agree to sell the house? She was quiet for a moment. She poured the hot water over the tea bag with the particular care she gave to small domestic acts. Then she said, your uncle has been very focused on this. I asked if she wanted to sell. She looked at me directly. What do you think? She said. Something in my chest went still. I sat down at her kitchen table. She sat across from me. The tea sat between us, steeping. She said, I've been thinking for some time about what I want to happen with this house. Her voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of someone covering terrain they have covered before, privately. I don't want it sold. I want it to stay in the family. And I want it to stay with the person who has been taking care of it. I said her name. She said, I spoke with an attorney 18 months ago. There's a transfer on death deed on file with the county. The house transfers to you when I'm gone. Your uncle doesn't know about it. Nobody knows about it. I sat very still. The deed that's in the firebox, she said. The copy we made that day. I went to the attorney 2 weeks after that. I had already decided. I thought about the tax correction letter. I thought about sitting at that same table with the firebox open between us. I thought about her saying, 2 years ago now, I'm going to remember that. My hands, flat on the table, had gone cold. The closing on Friday, I said carefully. What happens to the closing? My grandmother wrapped both hands around her tea mug. That, she said, is not my problem to solve. But I expect you might want to make a phone call. I went home and spent 3 hours on the phone. The first call was to the county recorder's office to confirm that the transfer on death deed was in the record exactly where my grandmother said it was. It was. Filed 18 months prior, notarized, recorded, a clean, unambiguous document in which Helen Vasquez designated me, Renata Vasquez Ochoa, as the sole transfer on death beneficiary of the property at 1147 Crestwood Lane. Irrevocable, without her signature on a revocation instrument. She had not signed any such revocation. The second call was to a real estate attorney named Patricia Okafor, whose name I found through the County Bar Association's referral line and who, when I explained the situation in 4 sentences, said, "Do you have the recording number?" I gave her the recording number. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The closing on Friday is not going to close. I want you to send me everything you have, and I will contact the title company today." I asked what would happen. She said that a transfer on death deed on a property constitutes an encumbrance that a title company is required to identify in the title search. She said that either the title company had found it and not disclosed it, which would be its own problem, or the title search had been incomplete, which was also its own problem, but that either way, the property could not transfer clear title to a buyer with an unresolved TOD deed in the record. She said, "Whoever sold this house didn't look at the title report carefully enough, or didn't know to look." I asked about my uncle. She said, "Does he have a power of attorney over your grandmother?" He did not. I knew he did not because my grandmother had specifically, quietly, and some time ago added me to the relevant accounts for exactly the kind of logistical access that required someone's name on file, not a POA, but enough of a footprint that I would have known if a POA instrument had been executed elsewhere. Patricia Okafor said, "Then your grandmother listed and is selling a property she owns, and there is a recorded instrument on that property that will prevent clear title from passing. Your uncle may have coordinated the listing, but your grandmother owns the house." She paused. "I'll need to speak with your grandmother directly to confirm she did not authorize or consent to revoke the TOD deed." I drove back to Crestwood Lane. My grandmother consented to the call readily, and with a composure I found almost unsettling, the composure of someone who had been waiting for this particular sequence of events and was not surprised to find it arriving. She confirmed to Patricia Okafor, in clear and specific language, that she had not authorized any revocation of the transfer on death deed, had not been informed that such revocation was a precondition of the sale, and had not, if she was being precise about it, fully agreed to the sale in the first place. She had, she said, told her son that she understood he had found a buyer. She had not told him she consented to proceed. There was a brief silence on the line. Patricia Okafor said, "Mrs. Vasquez, I'm going to send a letter to the title company today. I would recommend that you do not sign any additional documents related to this transaction until we've spoken again." My grandmother said that would not be a problem, because she had not signed anything related to this transaction to begin with, and did not intend to. After the call ended, she refilled her tea mug and said to me, "Your uncle is going to be very upset." I said I expected so. She said, "He means well." She said it plainly, without softening it into an excuse. Just a fact she wanted on the record. He's always thought he was the one who understood how things should work. I asked what she thought. She said, "I think understanding how things should work and understanding how things actually work are not always the same." She looked at me over the rim of her mug. "You understand how things actually work." I drove home and did not sleep particularly well. Not from distress exactly. From a kind of low hum of anticipation that sat in my chest and would not quiet itself. My phone rang at 9:47 that evening. My uncle. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 4 minutes long. His voice started measured and ended somewhere else. The words "already decided" appeared twice. The phrase "your grandmother agreed" appeared 3 times. At one point he said, "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, Renata," which was the first moment in the conversation where the warmth dropped away and something more structural showed through underneath it. I listened to the whole thing. Then I put my phone face down on the counter and went to bed. The next 2 days were a particular kind of difficult. My mother called Thursday morning. Her voice was careful. My mother is a careful woman, someone who has spent most of her life navigating between the people around her and absorbing the friction so that surfaces could stay smooth. She said she hadn't known about the TOD deed. I believed her. She said she wished someone had talked to her more directly before things got to this point, by which I understood her to mean both me and my uncle, and I thought that was probably fair. She said, "I just want everyone to come out of this okay." I said I did too. That was also true. She asked if I had talked to Uncle Berto. I said I had not. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's very angry, Renata." I said I understood. "He thinks you went around the family." I thought about what that phrase meant, applied to this situation. Going around a family that had listed a property without telling me. Going around a process I had been excluded from at every stage. Going around a closing I had not been informed of until a neighbor called from across the street. I said, "I contacted a title attorney about a document that was already in the public record. I didn't put it there. Grandma put it there." My mother was quiet again for a longer moment. Then she said, "I know." That was the whole conversation. 2 words, and I understood from them that she had already known, somewhere, that my uncle had moved faster and further than he should have, and that she had not stopped it, and that she was not entirely sure how to carry that knowledge right now. I told her I would see her Friday. My uncle's attorney, a man named Hargrove, who had been handling estate and property matters for the family intermittently for years, called me Thursday afternoon. He was professional, measured, clearly in possession of the basic facts by this point, and said that he wanted to understand my position before the closing. I said my position was that the property had a transfer-on-death deed filed with the county recorder 18 months ago, that the deed had not been revoked, and that the grantor had confirmed she had not authorized revocation. He said, "Ms. Vasquez Ochoa, I want you to know that if your grandmother was in any way influenced in executing that instrument, there may be grounds." I said, "My grandmother drove herself to the attorney's office. She made an appointment. She provided her own identification. The notary witnessed her signature. This is in the record." A pause. "Right," he said. "The title company," I said, "has already received correspondence from my attorney." Another pause, longer. "Right," he said again. He thanked me for my time. He did not suggest an alternative resolution. That night I drove to Crestwood Lane and sat in my grandmother's kitchen for 2 hours. She made tamales, not for any occasion, just because she felt like it, which was the only reason she ever needed. We ate at the kitchen table, and she told me about the fall she had planted the garden along the back fence, 1984, the year after my grandfather's mother had died, and left them $300 and a box of garden tools. She had planted tomatoes and zucchini and 1 rose bush that had not survived the first winter, but that she had replaced the following spring with a hardier variety that was still there, still producing, 40 years later. She did not mention the closing. She did not mention my uncle. She ate her tamales and told me about the rosebush and refill my coffee without asking if I wanted more. I thought, sitting there, she has known this was coming for 18 months. She has been waiting for it, calmly, the way she waited for everything she had already planned for. That thought settled somewhere in me that I would not find a word for until much later. The closing was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the offices of Ridgway Title and Escrow on Merchant Street downtown. I had not been invited. That will not surprise you. My uncle had organized the closing the way he had organized everything else about this transaction, as a contained event with a defined list of participants, and I was not on it. The buyer was a property investment firm that had been acquiring corner lots in that neighborhood for 18 months. The sellers, as my uncle understood it, were the family acting collectively. The family, as my uncle had defined it for purposes of this transaction, was himself, with my mother's nominal awareness and Melissa's peripheral involvement. I knew the time and location because Dottie Marchetti had seen the appointment on a notepad my grandmother had left on the kitchen counter during one of her visits, and Dottie, true to her nature, had committed it to memory and relayed it to me the following morning with the focused precision of someone who understood she was providing intelligence. I told my grandmother I planned to attend. She said, "I thought you might." I asked if she wanted to come. She considered this for a moment, a genuine consideration, not a dismissal. Then she said, "No, I think you can handle it. And I'd rather not watch your uncle's face when he finds out." I arrived at Ridgway Title and Escrow at 9:45. The receptionist looked up when I came in and asked my name. I gave it. She said she didn't have me on the attendee list for the closing. I said, "I'm the transfer-on-death beneficiary of the subject property. My attorney contacted your office yesterday." Something shifted in her expression, not alarm, exactly, but a kind of careful recalibration, the look of someone who has just been reminded of a complicating fact that was already in the file. She excused herself and disappeared through a door. She came back with a man who introduced himself as the title officer. His name was Mark Solis, compact and precise, with a neutral professional manner of someone trained to manage friction without generating it. He shook my hand. He said, "Ms. Vasquez Ochoa, I understand you have some questions about the title on this property." I said I didn't have questions. I said I had a recording number. He nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when a situation has clarified itself. He said, "Would you like to come in?" I came in. The conference room was a standard title company room, long table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with nothing on it, 2 stacks of paper at the head of the table where the title officer usually sat. My uncle was already there, in a sport coat, seated to the left of the buyer's representative, a younger man in a gray suit whose name I didn't know. My mother was there, hands folded on the table, her face doing the careful thing it did when she was managing her reaction. Hargrove, my uncle's attorney, was there, a notepad in front of him, pen uncapped. My uncle looked up when I walked in. His expression moved through 3 things quickly: surprise, then something harder than surprise, then a very controlled return to neutral. He said, "Renata." I said good morning. I sat down. There was a silence that lasted several seconds. The buyer's representative looked at the title officer. The title officer looked at his stack of papers. My uncle said, "You don't need to be here." I said, "I'm the TOD beneficiary on the property." "I think I do." Another silence. My uncle looked at Hargrove. Hargrove's expression had the quality of a man who already knew what was in the file and did not particularly relish the next few minutes. Mark Solis set down his papers, clasped his hands on the table, and said, in the voice of someone who has delivered similar news before and has learned to do it without inflection, "Before we proceed, I need to address an issue that came to our attention yesterday afternoon." My uncle said, "What issue?" Mark Solis said, "There is a transfer on death deed recorded against this property at the county recorder's office, instrument number." And he read the number aloud, clearly, from a sheet in front of him. The deed was executed 18 months ago by the property owner, Helen Vasquez, and designates Renata Vasquez Ochoa as the sole beneficiary upon the owner's death. The instrument has not been revoked. We cannot convey clear title to a buyer with an unresolved TOD deed in the chain. The room was very quiet. My uncle's face had gone a particular color, not red, but something drained and pale that was somehow more significant than red would have been. He looked at Hargrove. Hargrove said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "We'll need to verify the instrument." Mark Solis said, "We have verified it. It's in the public record." The buyer's representative, the young man in the gray suit, leaned slightly back in his chair in a way that suggested he had already understood the implication and was recalculating his morning. My uncle said, "My mother never mentioned," he stopped. Started again. "She signed papers. She agreed to the listing." Mark Solis said, "The listing agreement doesn't affect the title instrument. The TOD deed is a separate recorded document. Without either its revocation by the grantor or the grantor's passing, the property cannot be sold without the beneficiary's consent." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely, the way water fills a container, all the way to the edges. My uncle's attorney's pen was resting on his notepad. He had not written anything on it. I sat with my hands folded on the table in front of me and looked at nothing in particular and waited. My mother, across the table, had her hands still in her lap. She was looking at the table in front of her. A muscle near her jaw had gone tight. The buyer's representative said, quietly, to no one in particular, "So the closing isn't happening today?" Mark Solis said, "Not today, no." My uncle requested a recess. Mark Solis stepped out. The buyer's representative made a call in the hallway. Hargrove and my uncle spoke in low voices at the far end of the room, and I sat where I was and did not try to hear them. My mother came around the table and sat in the chair next to mine. She said quietly, "Did you know about the deed before this week?" I told her the truth. I had not known until my grandmother told me, 2 days ago. She nodded. She looked at the whiteboard. She said, "She never told anyone." I said, "She told me when she needed to." My mother was quiet for a moment. "She always knew what she was doing," she said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to recognition, the particular tone of a person understanding something they had been adjacent to for a long time without quite seeing it clearly. I said, "Yes." My mother put her hand briefly on mine. Then she got up and went back to her chair. Hargrove approached me while my uncle was in the hallway. He sat across from me and said, with the careful evenness of someone choosing words precisely, that he wanted to make sure I understood that any challenge to the TOD deed would require a showing of undue influence or incapacity at the time of signing, and that given what he now knew about the circumstances of the execution, he did not think such a challenge would be well-founded. He said this not as a concession exactly, but as information, the kind a professional delivers when he has assessed the situation and concluded that further litigation would be expensive and unlikely to succeed. I said I understood. He said, "For what it's worth, the title on that property is very clean." She had good counsel. I said, "She always did her homework." He almost smiled at that. Almost. My uncle came back into the room. He sat down across from me. He looked, for the first time I could remember in my adult life, like a man who didn't entirely know what to say. He said, "I didn't know about the deed." I said, "I know." "I wasn't trying to cut you out," he said. And then, more slowly, I didn't think you were. I didn't think it involved you." I said, "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't she tell me?" I thought about my grandmother at her kitchen table, wrapping both hands around her tea mug. I thought about the firebox and the tax correction letter, and the 2 weeks after that when she had driven herself to an attorney's office and made a decision about what she wanted the rest of her life and the life of her house to look like. I thought about 40 years of showing up for a garden that most people would have let go. I thought about a rose bush that had died in its first winter and been replaced with something hardier the following spring. I said, "I think she didn't want the conversation. She just wanted the outcome." My uncle looked at the table. Something in his face shifted. Not collapse, but something less armored than I'd seen there before. The closing did not happen. The buyer's representative left within the hour. The listing was pulled 2 weeks later, after a phone conversation between my grandmother, Patricia Okafor, and the real estate agent, in which my grandmother said, clearly and without apparent drama, that she had changed her mind about selling and that she hoped everyone involved could be compensated appropriately for their time and effort. The agent was compensated. The buyer's firm sent a brief letter expressing disappointment. It was very politely worded. The months that followed were not simple, and I won't pretend they were. My uncle and I did not speak for 6 weeks. When we resumed contact, it was halting, careful, and built on a foundation of things left somewhat unsaid, which I think is the most honest way I can describe a family relationship that had been cracked and was now being held together by collective effort rather than by the easy assumption that had held it before. He came to Crestwood Lane for Christmas that year. He sat at my grandmother's table and ate her food, and did not say anything about the property. She did not bring it up. He called me in February to ask a question about estate planning. Not about the house, about his own arrangements, something he'd been putting off and had decided to stop putting off. He said, "You seem to know more about how this stuff works than I gave you credit for." I said I had learned from a good teacher. There was a pause. He said, "Yeah, I think we all did." That was the closest we came to talking about it directly. It was enough. My mother and I had lunch the second Saturday of every month for the following year, which was something we had never done before. She asked about my work. I asked about hers. We talked about my grandmother in the way you talk about someone who is still present, as a living concern, not a subject of retrospect. I think those lunches were her way of rearranging something, of putting herself in a different relationship to what had happened, even if we never named it that way. Melissa sent a card. It said, simply, that she thought Grandma had made a good decision and that she hoped we could see each other soon. We had dinner 2 months after that. It was fine. Some fences take longer than others. My grandmother is 84 now. She is still on Crestwood Lane. The garden along the back fence is still producing. The rosebush came back strong this year. the fourth straight spring of good blooms, which my grandmother says is because she finally got the soil composition right and stopped overthinking it. She still makes the coffee too strong. She still knows when someone is sneaking down the stairs by the third step from the bottom. She still shows up for the things she has decided matter, every single day, without announcement. I visit on Thursdays, sometimes Saturdays, sometimes both. The transfer on death deed is still in the county record. Nothing has changed about it and nothing needs to. It exists. It is on file. It is exactly what my grandmother wanted it to be, not a weapon, not a declaration, just a quiet, dated document that says what it says in plain language and requires no one to argue on its behalf. I think about that sometimes when I'm working. I sit in front of documents all day at my job, the kind of paperwork that defines what belongs where and for how long and under what conditions, and I understand in a way I might not have before that the most important things are often the ones that were never meant to make noise. They were meant to be there when they were needed. That's all. That's enough. Here is the thing I carried out of that conference room on Merchant Street, the thing I've turned over more times than I can count since then. My grandmother did not fight. She did not argue. She did not call a meeting or write a letter or confront anyone across a table. She sat in a lawyer's office 18 months before any of this came to a head, and she said what she wanted, and she signed what needed signing, and she went home and made tea. And then she waited, calmly, for the world to catch up to the decision she had already made. There are people who mistake quietness for passivity. There are people who see someone who doesn't argue and conclude that they don't have a position. There are people who read a family gathering and see who raises their voice and decide that's where the power is. My grandmother raised her voice approximately never. She planted things and came back for them. She showed up without announcement and stayed without requiring credit for it. And when the moment came where someone tried to take something that wasn't theirs to take, she had already, quietly, made sure there was nothing to take. I learned more from her than I learned from any class I ever sat in. And I am still learning. That's my story. A fire-resistant box, a notary stamp, and a rosebush that came back harder than anyone expected. If you were Mark Solis, the title officer who had to halt that closing with everyone seated at the table, what do you say first? Do you open with the recording number, or do you ask if everyone's had a chance to review the title report? And if you were my uncle in that room, hearing it for the first time, is there anything that gets said differently that changes how this ends? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.